Welcome back to Finlos Loves. In this episode, you'll hear the continuation of my conversation with Eva regarding communication and relationships. I think that most people, and I don't know why this is, but I think that most people try to find themselves in the conversations that they're engaged in. So how are we, what do we have in common?
Uh-huh.
And when that is not easily found, then you don't make that connect. They're unable to make that connection, which is why there's such a tendency for people to say this thing. And this is one of my pet peeves. And I've told you this, when the people say, I know exactly how you feel,
Yeah, I hate that.
because they're trying to force a connection that does not exist.
Yes.
So whether we're talking about gender issues or race issues or indigenous issues or anything, what you should be listening for is the things that we don't have in common, to build connection and share the story and listen to the story and then tell your own story. So that way you're not trying to force yourself into the other person's story to have the shared experience, because you can't. They're separate experiences. We are separate lives. And instead you take the two stories and you connect them and you build a third story.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that that's part of the problem. And I think that is where communication falters so frequently, is that one person, the person on the listening end, is so busy trying to find a point of access, a point of entry. So, oh yeah. I've totally, you're talking about how you're trying to connect to your indigenous roots by growing a garden in the front yard, and the message that people hear is, oh yeah, I've raised tomatoes before. When really what you're talking about has nothing to do with tomatoes. It has to do with connecting with your indigenous roots and decolonizing and finding healing spaces. But all they have is the tomatoes. And so that's all they hear is the tomatoes.
Yeah. Well, and generally, I don't want to have that kind of conversation with those kinds of people, but we're also limited to who we have in our environment, right? So, and I think like there's a difference between I completely understand, or, oh yeah, I know exactly what that's like, or like, here, let me tell you how this like experience from a coworker who's nothing like you, um, and it's not even your experience, but you're trying to use some story that you heard from somebody else, like to kind of try to connect the dots. And like I think it's okay to say to people like, I have no idea what that's like, and I'm like struggling right now with what I should say, because I really want to support you and I really just don't know how to. And I think that like that vulnerability I think is a lot more meaningful to me than somebody trying to make some shit up on the spot, because that's just gonna offend me. It's gonna really like offend me, and I think it's even worse when they don't say anything, because then it's almost like I just spent like half an hour to whatever. Like I can talk for a long time when it's meaningful, right? And especially when it's if another individual has requested or made a bid for connection, and you are like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing, and you pour emotional energy into it. Like it is actually energy. Like there is an exchange. It's I don't like to think of things as limited resources, and yet, you know, when we prioritize something, we are lending a certain amount of energy into it, and we're saying this is important enough for me to show up, so let me show up. And so when you do that and like there isn't it doesn't feel like there's another body at the other end, it's disappointing, and it informs how you you show up next time, right? And so that's a communication. The lack of communication is a communication. And that sucks because when you are unsure of what to say, sometimes that's all you need to say. But you do need to come back to the communication. Like if you say, because otherwise it becomes like we talked about Gottman a little bit earlier, right? And one of Gottman's things is like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and one of the major downfalls to relationships is the idea of stonewalling. And stonewalling is just basically like cutting communication off. And so when we make a bid for connection, and the other individual, whether it be a romantic partner or not, when their response to that is sort of to give you the cold shoulder, to kind of be like, well, I don't know what to say about that, or or never get back to it. That's so harmful, because that's akin to ostracizing, or what's the word, like when you kick somebody out? Like,
Banishment.
yeah, so like the idea of banishment, that's and in our current culture, like especially on social media now, like there's this idea of like cancel culture, right? So like cancel culture's become kind of the newer way to kind of do that, but yeah, it's the idea is like you're cutting an individual off from like the ability to stay connected, through a conversation. And it's okay to, you and I talk about this a lot, like it's okay to take breaks, like, but that has to be actually communicated. Like if you need to take a break, usually an individual needs to be like, I think I need a break. Like, let's take a break, and then it's not just like, let's take a break, but it's like you set up a specific time frame to come back to the topic so that there's some sense of closure to that topic.
And like a realistic time frame.
A realistic time frame. You can't be like, oh, like a week from now, 2 weeks from now. Like it has to be, a realistic frame, because otherwise you get back to it and you're like, oh yeah, it's been so long that like I don't even know what to say anymore. And so that's a cop out. That's a like,
it's an
okay,
avoidance
yeah.
tactic.
Yeah, it's an avoidance tactic. You didn't want to actually. It's and I see this a lot with individuals who struggle to really connect with their emotions, and who are very conflict averse. And it really sucks. The other side of that is that people who are conflict averse, when you try to force the issue of like embracing conflict, they feel cornered, and because they feel cornered, they act like a scared animal and they lash. What does that look like for you, Paco?
What does what look like for me?
What does it look like for you?
Being cornered and lashing out? Oh man. No, I panic if I feel as if I am not pretty when I feel cornered. And of course, if I were thinking rationally, I would obviously realize there is no corner. I'm standing in the middle of a room with 10 different ways I can give a response that make perfect sense.
Yeah.
But because I'm panicking, and because I'm not thinking clearly, and because the primitive brain is superseding the prefrontal cortex, or
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
is that right?
Yeah, it's the neural core.
Yeah.
There's a
And
couple different words
because
for it.
because my emotions are in charge as opposed to like my actual like logical brain, I'm not able to think rationally, and I feel attacked, and I feel that I need to lash out, and you go for the most painful, harmful, self-destructive thing you can lash out at, and it's yourself. It's always going to be the thing that's going to cause the most harm in that moment. You're going to say the stupidest thing possible, anything to end that moment, even if it makes the next moment even harder, because it will. No matter what, it will, because you're going to say something hurtful and damaging, and that's then the conversation will end thank God the conversation is finally over.
Unless you're having it with Eva.
Right. Or no, even no. And I'm, yes, you are special. You are special. But I think anybody, once that panic settles and you think about, well, I hope that most people have that moment where, and I think that most people do, and that's what most people envision reconciliation to be, right? It's like, oh my God, I wasn't thinking straight. Please, understand that that was not my intent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was panicking. What makes Eva different? The accountability needs to be there.
Mm-hmm.
That, okay, cool. I get that you were panicking and you didn't mean to hurt me. Harm was done.
Mm-hmm.
And now, in addition to the conversation that we didn't finish, we also need to address the harm that was done.
Yeah.
And likely that's not the first time. So we need now to address not only the conversation that we have to shelf for now, because now we have to talk about the pattern that occurs.
Yes.
That when we have these hard conversations, you constantly immediately go into the panic and you start to lash out. So now it's so much more complex than it needs to be, than it should have been, when if you would have embraced just the 30 seconds of discomfort of having to say the thing that you're scared of saying because you're afraid that the other person is going to be mad. Well, yeah, now they're 10 times as mad.
Yes.
Or you're embarrassed to say it because you think that the thing that you're going to say is going to make you look stupid, or you think it's going to make you look like you're some sort of freak or a weirdo, or whatever it is, because you're avoiding that potential conflict. It's always going to be worse.
Yeah.
Always, 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 always. And my rational brain gets that. I do. And yet I still have the pattern. I still have the tendency to not deal with things in the moment that they happen, because it's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been slowly throughout my life embracing the concept that I am somewhat of a freak. And that's okay, right? But what I will say is that, early on in our relationship, like when I started, and this was really early on, when I started to realize that this was a pattern, that this was the thing that was happening between us. Do you remember the code word that we?
Picklehead.
Yeah, we came up. So one of the
that will always be there.
One of the techniques that we developed, no, we don't use it anymore. We just freaking revolt. Like, we're like, never mind picklehead. Like, but picklehead was a code word that we developed in order for me to be able to tell Paco, and Paco to be able to tell me, if it came to that
if
it came to that we were communicating in a way that was harmful and not helpful. And yeah, I don't know what happened to that, because we for a while it did work for us.
Well, I know exactly what happened is we stopped talking.
I didn't stop talking.
No, but we stopped talking. And so we weren't fighting because we just weren't talking that much. Yeah, I think it's just I think it's really easy in relationships to fall into patterns. And there were a few years where you and I, like, we didn't put our relationship on the back burner, but we were in school and working, and I think that we just got comfortable. We got comfortable. And so I think that I don't even know, like, and it wasn't a bad time either. I just think that there were a couple, it was maybe just 1 year where we sort of stopped engaging with each other for a while. And I'm really proud of that we're looking at our relationship now, and we can think of these eras or these epochs or these spaces. And I talk about this time a lot, and you don't remember this time very well, because we've actually not fought, but we've argued about you sometimes will say, well, it didn't used to be like this, and then I'll say, yeah, it wasn't like this because we just didn't talk.
Uh-huh.
And you don't think about that. And there were periods of time that I think part of it was my mom getting sick and dying. Part of it was your grandfather getting sick and dying. I think that there were just coinciding periods where we kind of just clammed up for a while. And none of that is I don't even know where that's going, but I don't think you're a freak. I think you are the behaviors that that we're jokingly referring to as being freakish are actually the ones that we should all strive for, which is radical honesty in its true meaning, not in the,
like being able to be an ass and
yeah,
and just be like, oh, I'm just being honest.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
like radical honesty in the relationship sense, where it's like, these are the needs that I have, these are the ways in which they're not being met, right? That sort of thing. Everybody should feel safe to be able to be honest in their relationship. Like, that's normal. I think the fact that people are afraid to tell the truth, I think that's not normal. I think that holding people accountable is not freakish. It's normal. And when I'm talking about that, when we have a fight and then people like will say, yeah, okay, fine, we're going to take a break. We'll come back to it whenever, 6 months from now. That's not accountability. That's avoidance. And you don't do that. You don't allow that to happen. Like, that's normal. It should be normal that when somebody's an ass, they were held accountable and they're like, look, I love you as a person.
Yeah.
But this thing you did here was not okay.
Yeah, and that impacts my ability to trust you, and it impacts my ability to show up for you, and because then I'm dealing with my own hurt and my own emotions, and I if it's clear to me that you as an individual are unable to show up for me in those ways, then it means me reprioritizing my time to show up for myself in those ways, because ultimately, if I don't have a relationship of care and love with myself, how am I able to have that with anybody else? Right. And like that has been a forever work in progress. And that's actually what I mean when I say, like, I'm a freak. Like, I say that in the in the Santa Gold sense of the freak like me word. Freak like me. Yeah. like I say that like as in like I'm gonna like go out like flags ablazing with my freak self. Like I'm okay. Like I really love this person that I'm forever going to continue to become, and I understand, like I have a hard time with people coming and going, because I experience grief very deeply and I experience love very deeply. And I think I tell people that, like, when I often when I first meet them, or like when if I'm developing a relationship with someone that is more intentional, like I will tell them, I'm like, hey, like I'm not kidding, like I love people hard, and for as even if it's a like brief or long distance, like we have those people, right? We have those people who we've cultivated the kinds of relationships with, who if they call us like once a year, and want to have like a really deep intentional conversation, like I will drop things and like just be like, yep. I think it's just like it's an investment of time, of energy, and I think every person that you built some kind of intentional relationship with requires a type of communication. And so it's like, I don't know, every time you connect with somebody like that, you have to learn their communication style. And like there's something really exciting about doing that. And then I also find it frustrating when I see that people struggle with others because they don't do that. Not everybody's invested in figuring out how others communicate and trying to bridge that gap.
We talk about a lot about early relationship energy and how in the beginning it seems easy because there's a lot to talk about. There's learning. There's just a lot to share. But then how very quickly those dynamics play out, and it kind of we see really who's willing to reciprocate and who isn't. And I think that I don't know what that's going towards, but I think the idea, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that reciprocation is essential.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're talking about time and energy as an investment in a relationship, that it can't be one way. It has to be something that is nurtured in both directions.
Yeah, I think you're gonna get to with any relationship, you're gonna get to a point in which you've told all your past stories. So now you're at a point where you have to create new experiences and new stories with this individual. And hopefully if you're a healthy individual, you're also fostering other relationships and building experiences outside of that individual, and those are the other ways that you contribute to keeping the relationship new and going. Is you're coming back and you're saying, oh my god, can you believe this thing that happened to me today? And I think we rely a little bit too much on our work experiences now to do that, and that itself can be kind of toxic. And more I'm finding, like, I think maybe our lives are a little bit different because as a teacher, I think you're in a good position to build relationships with colleagues that are meaningful. And I think the same is true of me as a social worker. I think that I'm in a position to build decent relationships with individuals who are like-minded.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of those things that you're talking about, or that we were talking about before, about where communication is really important, is when when we are developing new relationships and meeting new people, or maintaining relationships that we had prior to a current romantic or any kind of relationship. And so I can speak for myself. I won't say we. I might experience anxiety about spending time with this person because I'm afraid that you'll think that I value that person's time more, or that there's something untoward going on. And so rather than just be like, hey, I went and I did this thing because blah, 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 I just won't say anything. Right.
Uh-huh.
And then that's when the non-communication becomes problematic, because even if nothing was going on, the fact that nothing is said is not okay, because the transparency is what's required. And so those are the types of things where I think that a lot of people experience anxiety about communication, because we are more afraid of what the other person might hear as opposed to what our intentions actually are, because we're not giving that person enough credit, or because we haven't discussed what communication is for to begin with, or those expectations of transparency or boundaries, or any of those things that are perfectly normal, natural things that should happen in every relationship.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those things, because of our acculturation, because of the way that we're raised, because a lot of us have really problematic models,
Mm-hmm.
we learn through mistakes rather than
Yeah.
by doing it right the first time.
Yeah, and I think I think unfortunately, um, the models that we had included that, right? Like I think, like if I think back to my biological father's relationship with my mom, and my mom, like you know there was there was a definite like incongruency when it came to their needs. Like, I think I mentioned that my dad was like a really vivacious and sort of like spirited person, and he liked to party. He was a partier. My mom was not. At the time. I think he uh at the same time though, like I think he uh, was of an era, right? Where like the idea of like your wife being also a vivacious person was not okay. So he was very controlling. I remember him like not even wanting, like he didn't want my mom to drive. He didn't want, anything to like control her goings and comings. And she could wear makeup, but only in certain ways. She could dress only in certain ways. And but at the same time, like he was going out and he was having affairs, and he was drugging and he was drinking, and sometimes he'd disappear altogether. And so that communicated something to us about like how he prioritized us, right? And in the grand scheme of things. And in the meantime, my mom was sort of left as like the primary breadwinner, and she was, working like this like crappy like, minimum wage job in America because my father wanted to come here because supposedly this was the land of opportunities. And it turned out not to be for us. What I don't know, what I internalized about that is that like men sort of have like this double standard for women about like what we're allowed to to want and to expect and to demand. And so I think my I saw my mom kind of go a little crazy after that, like, and I hate that word. So I saw my mom react from a place of being so stifled by this really early relationship, right? And she was grieving. This is how That's actually part of how she got involved with my father, is she had just lost her adoptive mom. And so I think that was like a painful thing to watch as a child who had to come into adulthood very quickly, because you talk about you're the youngest of five. I was the eldest of four, and my mom wasn't able to really be there for any of us. So I kind of took on the role of like, okay, like I'm the eldest, like I get to watch the kids when mom's not around. I get to like, and I struggled with like not having the tools to really help my siblings, through a lot of that. But yet like, my siblings will still say like you were still, you know like if you hadn't been there we wouldn't have made it. And I'm like, I never got to just be a kid. I never just got to like do the fun thing. And then here I am like going from high school immediately into college, immediately into grad school, immediately into parenthood. And it's like, oh yeah, I was already a parent to my parent, a parent to my parent, and a parent to my siblings. And so, sometimes the last thing you want to do is like parent a partner too, and so because you're starting to realize that you need a certain amount of like holding and healing of like that inner kid who never just got to be a kid. But I think like early on, like I knew that. Like I came into the relationship knowing those things, having a certain amount of like, I'm not even sure, I think we talked about this early on too, that I wasn't even like entirely sure that I wanted to get married. And like it's sort of like I knew that that was an expectation, you know, for us, that was kind of like the next level of like, how do we show that we care for each other? And there didn't seem to be any other, like realistically, societally, there wasn't really any indication of like how else to show that to each other.
Right. It's the next milestone.
The next milestone was like, oh shit, we get married, and and then we have kids.
Right. Because literally, that was the question. We were at a school event and that guy was there. And he's like, "Oh, you guys just got married. When you gonna make it official and have kids?"
Yeah, and I was like, we had just gotten married. Um, and I had there was a certain amount of like just nervousness for me too, and like cohabitating, because I was sort of afraid of like what will happen if this doesn't work out, and also, oh, like how is my grandfather, my old school grandfather, Catholic grandfather, going to interpret this, like us moving in together? And actually, he was fairly cool about it. Like he was, I don't know, I think because he was rural and like, I think ideas of what is it called, like when common law marriage, I think, was a pretty common thing in rural communities, where he was growing up. So, and like, obviously, like the more religious that the country became, the more like the ideal of like Catholicism and Catholic weddings. But even then, like parishes were pretty, like the churches were pretty small, and like those weddings tended to be pretty small too. So it was sort of like, okay, cool, like we do this thing and then what happens, right? But I do remember having early conversations about like, well, what if this doesn't work? Like, what are we gonna do then? Like, how do we deal with, like, if we find that we're at a spot where our needs grow or are different? And we had ideas about how to handle that, and then it didn't go that way, right? So it's hard for me because it's like you can have these early conversations, and you should be having these early conversations, but make sure that the other person's actually communicating back, because like for me it was sort of like if you weren't saying too much, or if you were saying minimal, like, yeah, okay, cool, like, yeah, that makes sense, it's like, okay, cool, you agree, you're on board with what I'm saying, and you've made some kind of agreement with me that this is how we're going to handle things. So that's the piece that adds injury when, when things get hard and they don't go the way that you agreed when you've made an agreement.
Yeah. And I know that, we've, we talk about patterns and how those things become patterns. And that's why when harm is done, it becomes increasingly hard to regain trust, is because that hurt gets multiplied.
Yeah. But I think the stakes are higher because now we're parents, and my, a lot of my energy and priority is based around like what are we now communicating to these young women who we're raising, and how are we going to further inhibit or empower them, right, to stand up for their needs, in a society that is largely goes against what they may need or want, and I think unfortunately men have more power in shaping that to a degree, and also opt out of the ways that they do the harm in shaping that. Like I've come to terms with the fact that, like, yes, I have a responsibility to raise kids in general, right? Regardless of how of what their gender identification is, and we do have a kid who identifies as non-binary at the moment, and but even if we had a child assigned male at birth, I had like really strong ideas, and in some ways I'm almost wondering if, like, you know remember we had friends who were like, I really hope you have a boy, because we need boys raised by people like you. And that was like a scary ass thought, because I was like, oh man, like, oof, men walk around with so much privilege and like doing so much harm. It's like, what are the responsibilities of fathers in our society to shape the ways that harm isn't passed on? And particularly, like, honestly, it's modeling that in their treatment of their partners. And so if you're doing harm in the way that you model the treatment of your partner, then there you go.
Right.
Right.
Because then they see, well, if I'm the same as my mom, and then the person who's male who I'm closest to is treating my mother that way, then is that what I'm supposed to allow to happen to me as well?
Yeah, there's one or the other. Or you identify with the male parent, and you decide that it's easier to reenact those behaviors. So because there's such an, there's the idea of like internalized toxic masculinity too, right? So either we uphold the behaviors of toxic masculinity through pressure and through acceptance, or we reenact them, and that's a form of communication too. That's a way that we shape our, our future reality and our current reality too, not just future. And I think that that's why a lot of relationships do end, because people have to weigh what it means to stay. And we live in a society that is very disposable. We feel like, we buy things, we want to get them as cheaply as possible. And when they break or, don't function the way we would like for them to, we get rid of them. And we treat human beings the same exact way. And when I say that I love hard, that's the piece, is that I'm always gonna push myself to the limit of, and sometimes beyond my limit, honestly, to be like, I want to stay here, I want to be here for this, and you know I'm trying to communicate my limit, and sometimes pushing myself past it in order to try to like show people that I'm willing to show up, because I have like really high hope, right? Like I like a whole like core piece of my identity is shaped around like being a person with hope, and I think that's my mom never really gave me a really great explanation for why she named me what she did, but my name means life giver. So if I can give life to something that I cannot yet see, that's the whole purpose of, like, that's how we create, right? And I believe in my ability to create. Like I do believe in my ability to manifest. And so if I believe in my ability to manifest, if I believe in my ability to heal, and that's another core aspect of who of how I identify as a healer, then I sometimes, uh, damn man, sometimes I see that tree coming fast, and I'm like, no, it's not time to bail yet, Like I'll wait till that very last minute before I bail, and sometimes to my own detriment, I think, sometimes to my own detriment, because then there's so much more. Like if you wait too long and you hit that tree, there's that that process to healing is a little longer. And I think that's what the other person on the other end of the line has to realize, right? That if you have an individual who's willing to wait that long and incur that kind of damage, then it becomes part of your responsibility to also deal with that damage that you've created or that you've allowed to happen with your inaction. And that's more often than not what I'm dealing with, is people's inaction. People's like sort of just like checking out, the opposite of communication. So how are you feeling about this?
I'm listening and I'm feeling it. And, I'm obviously taking the things that you're saying and applying them to the things that we've gone through and understanding what you mean by those things, and seeing the moments in which my lack of communication have caused those harms, and not wanting to both repeat that pattern, but not repeat it by avoiding situations, instead by doing the thing that I know that will cause the most clean healing, which is the honest communication, which is Yes, it's not because that's the we're not saying that communication isn't sometimes hard and it sometimes hurts, but it's better to have the clean hurt that will heal
Yes.
um, than the messy hurt that will take a lot longer and might not heal.
Yeah. You can actually usually get to a pretty good place with people if you keep pushing through. Like if you push through the first layers of just like discomfort and hurt and insecurity and miscommunication as you're trying to find a common language, often you get to a good place of like, okay, I think I see, I think I understand, I think I see you, you know? And that's what we all want. It's like we all want to be seen by the other person and held in high regard. And so often we don't, we get to like the stage of like, wow, you just like, I tried to do something and you bit my head off, and like I'm just pissed, and like I think that's uh, that that's a coping mechanism, right? Like it's almost like it's easier to set traps and injure the other person than to allow them in with the high stake of like being seen. And because we deal with so much daily shame about who we are.
Yeah, I think that communication requires a level of vulnerability that I think a lot of people are scared of.
Yeah. So we didn't talk about Encanto at all.
We haven't got there yet.
Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, come on. I mean, if like the lowest bar piece is we don't talk about Bruno, right? Like, if we really want. So what's really exciting about this is that in a couple weeks I'm doing a webinar for a series called Yo Soy Sam, and Sam is just the acronym for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so I've now been doing these, I think, since 2018, so a couple years in a row. And I think the last one that I presented on was the legacy of the conquest, which was all about rape as a tool of colonialism. And so this year we were really wanted to kind of hone in on intergenerational trauma and resilience from the lens of Encanto. And so I'm really excited because I think anytime that there's like a kiddie movie to kind of like really bring home really complex concepts through the lens of like a cartoon, that really helps. And I do this with Inside Out as well, for the neurobiology of trauma. But so with Encanto, you've got Abuela, right? And then you've got this like sort of newer generation with Mirabel and well, and all the cousins and her sisters obviously too. So but we're talking about communication, right? And so with Bruno, I love that. I don't know. I think of all the characters, in some ways, I relate most to Bruno.
Why is that?
I think there are a lot of reasons why, but um, I think Bruno is like a super sensitive person and has access to sort of like knowledge of how things are gonna go, but even admittedly by his own, like, at one point he's like, hey, like half of what I'm telling you is not like because I've had a big revelation from like the cosmos or anything. It's just because I'm able to look at patterns and see like if this pattern continues, what's gonna happen. And I'll call it like often, like I'll tell Paco, I'm like, oh, I'm puzzle piecing. A lot of times when I'm working a problem out in my head about something someone said, I'm really like, I don't know, you can attest to this or not.
Absolutely.
I am hard to lie to.
There's a look that Eva has when
Yeah.
when she's puzzling.
Yeah. Because
And
I have
she'll
moments
literally
when
she'll
it's
say
like,
she'll say stop.
yeah.
Don't talk. I'm putting things together.
Yeah.
And then she'll say it and it's done. Yeah.
And often it's like sometimes it even comes in the middle of the night. Like I'll wake. It sucks because my sleep is so weird.
Welcome to parenthood.
It's not just parenthood, it's trauma, you know. So for those who are listening who don't know, like um I have complex PTSD from childhood trauma. And so, you know, my sleep is weird. For lack of a better way to explain it. But you know, there are nightmares, there are, you know, and for a while I think I got a little bit better, and then like parenthood kind of like threw a wrench in that again. You know, so my sleep cycles are weird, and often like if I could um adequately work with my trauma, I would work very much like a Spanish person and have naps every day in order to deal with some of the. But yeah, sometimes like if you know I don't do well if I'm mad or if I'm upset about something. My brain will continue to work on that, um, to try to like come to some kind of conclusion about it, and particularly when things don't seem to add up.
The term that we have developed in our family is chatterboxing. And so Eva chatterboxes.
I do chatterbox.
Like we'll be going to bed and the lights will go off and
I'm still talking.
I'll be it'll be quiet for a few minutes and I'll start to doze and then Eva will just pick up the thread and just talk and talk and talk, because talking is very much a part of the process. It's
Yes.
because, you know, neurobiologically, hearing the thought out loud allows you a second chance to process the thought.
Yes.
Because you think it, you say it, you hear it, and then it's going through a different process that way. And so Eva chatterbox is the problem, and then we'll it sounds like it's on repeat, but really every time it's just adding a new layer of data. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And this will happen like even when I'm like healing from something. So like I might want to, you know, and I think this is hard for people gendered male too, right? Because a lot of times there'll be this concept that like, oh, we talked about it and we dealt with it and now you're bringing it up again. And it's like, can I cuss on here?
Go.
Yeah. It's like, motherfucker, I'm not done with it. Like, I'm not done. We're going to talk about it until I'm done. You know, and it's like, and that's normal. Like, let's normalize the fact that lots of us are going to have to talk about these things over and over again because we're not done feeling into what happened. All right. And so many times, like, our feelings are minimized and gaslit, you know, and we're told that we're crazy. And then we realize, oh, yeah, this whole time I was made to feel like I was crazy. And yet it was all true. It was all real. And there's like validation in that, but then there's also anger. And so the world isn't really used to us expressing our anger. And even more so as, you know, Black, Indigenous, like people of color, you know. And you know, there's like the recent example of Will Smith, which I'm like pissed about the outcome of that. I don't want to speak too much to that because I am, you know, I like clearly I feel like people who are way more qualified to speak to Black people's experiences than I am. But I feel for them. Like I feel for him, and I feel for Jada Pinkett Smith, and I'm just like watching it. I'm like this is getting ridiculous. Like this, like honestly, in my own neighborhood, this is exactly what would have happened. Like we would have met after school, we would have like kicked I mean, we would have punched and kicked and scraped and like pulled hair, and gotten done with it, and then it would have been done. Um, but yeah, you don't talk about people like that and expect that nothing's gonna happen. Definitely, you don't.
So what you're saying is, I'm trying to build an analogy here. Hang on, bear with me.
Yeah.
Okay. Bruno is. Hang on, I'm thinking through it. So Bruno is
repression.
Right. So Bruno is the insult. But we don't talk about Bruno because to talk about it means that we have to scrap it out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's exactly it. Yeah. So Bruno is just what's really sad about that whole situation is that Bruno's doing what I feel like I tried to do, right? Is you name the truth, but the thing is that the truth is always a freaking elephant in the room.
Right. Everybody knows it already anyways.
Yeah, everybody's like just trying to ignore the fact that it exists.
Right.
And how dare you name the elephant in the room? And so, I think that we find there are roles that we play in our society. There are roles we play at work. There are roles we play in our families. And like, we've had these I don't know, we've called them different things at different times, but with like staff retreats, or we'll do strategic planning kind of meetings, and we'll invite like outside speakers and trainers to come in and do work with us. And a couple times we've had, and the last one we had was her first name, and she talked about how one of the roles that individuals take in their organizations, especially in nonprofits, is that there's usually a truth speaker. And so this is not just like a role that I've apparently taken on in my family, right? Like I'll often say something really uncomfortable, like something that makes other people feel uncomfortable, that is true, but I'm just kind of like saying it openly. And then like people will just kind of do the thing where like they shuffle uncomfortably, but don't actually talk about it after I've mentioned it. But at least I put it out there, and then that way, like if there's anybody who wants to have a conversation about it, they will. And if they don't, they don't. And, for me, it's like, it's really important because I want like our girls to be able to have these conversations openly. And I love that our kids are able to have certain conversations a lot more openly. I remember the first time that Galicia told one of her cousins, that, do you remember that conversation? She told her cousin that they were playing with a baby doll, and we specifically bought this baby doll that was anatomically correct for Galicia because she was about to have a baby sister, and we had made it a point, to say that we were gonna buy like a cheapy doll until we knew the sex of the baby, and then we would buy an anatomically correct doll to be able to talk about that with her. And so we did, and so this baby doll has a vulva, and we're like, hey, vulva this, vulva that, like the inner canal is called a vagina. And one day she just drops this she just drops this knowledge because it's like, no, the baby's a boy, and Galicia's like, no,
Nope,
that is not true. Let me tell you why. this baby doll has a vulva. And like, what is a vulva? But let me tell you what, there are grown men who don't know the word vulva, don't actually realize that the whole female genitalia is called a vulva because they don't actually communicate with women.
some women
Women don't know that they have vulvas
because their doctors are men.
Because their doctors are men. And then also that, like, obviously, like, whether you have a vulva or a penis, it doesn't necessarily mean, like, it isn't necessarily an indicator of your gender, which blows even more people's minds, right? Like, we had to, like, have a whole conversation around, like, men who menstruate.
Yep.
Within our organization, right? It's like, hey, yes, men can be raped and get pregnant. You know why? Because trans folks exist
They do, in
and they're
fact,
here to
exist.
stay. And they
Yes.
have always existed,
Yep.
and so these are realities. And it's like, so not talking about things doesn't mean they don't exist. So not talking about Bruno doesn't erase the fact that he existed within that household, that he existed within those walls, and he was a really hurting individual. And I just like I appreciate the movie, and I also just feel like they never really did him justice because he was really ostracized from the family
Yep. For pointing out the truth.
for pointing out the truth. And then like that scene where he's like recreated like the kitchen or the dining room table behind the walls right outside the kitchen was heartbreaking for me, because I know so many kids who feel like they're like the odd kid out, and who is just kind of like in the family but not in the family, and that's not okay.
Mm-mm.
Nobody
Yeah.
should feel that way.
All he wanted was inclusion.
All he wanted was inclusion. And so I think that that's why Mirabel and him are able to forge such a strong connection, because what I see there are like two different generations that are parallel. And so Mirabel is kind of like his counterpart in this newer generation. She's the one who is sort of like slightly outside of the norm and like trying really hard to be a part of the family, and also just to be honest about what's going on. And every step of the way, she's getting sidelined.
Yep.
And she's kind of got it like they're trying to like tear her down and like to be like, you need to stop, you're trying too hard.
And all the work that she's doing to keep the family together goes completely unrecognized. And actually, yeah, just unrecognized and made pretend that it doesn't exist, because she's doing the work of being the emotional glue of the family.
Yes.
And parallel to what you're saying, Bruno behind the scenes is literally fixing the cracks in the house
Yes.
that nobody sees.
Yes.
And so it's a really good parallel.
Yeah, it's a and the thing is that like the undertone of that too is not just the invisibility of the emotional labor, but there's like a spiritual aspect to it, right? Because all in all, what holds the miracle together is it was born of abuela's grief, but it was not just born of abuela's grief, it was born of her husband's sacrifice. And so in the moment that he turns away from her because they're about to cross the river, and these like really violent people, remember, like they leave their town to get away from the violence, and these violent people are now in pursuit, and so they're fully aware of what they're capable of, and so she witnesses his death. And that's the thing, is like she witnesses his death. She's now left with triplets. And so like her grief in that moment is so strong that between that sacrifice and the grief, that candle, which she calls the miracle, is born. But it's really her way of not dealing with the grief. And it was something that at that moment was adaptive, because she, you have 3 kids who need you. You can't stop to grieve, right? But then she got older and her kids grew up and they had their own lives, and she could have started the process of like, hey, I need to do some healing around this, and she never did.
Right. It's also the obsession of we have this miracle, and we have a very specific function. Our function is to serve these people. So she's constantly, as opposed to dealing with her own pain, looking outward to try to be of service, to serve these people, to have a function, to have a job. So she's never looking internally, she's always looking outward.
She's externalizing, right? Even past like what now we've got a flourishing town, and the town is good, and she's putting all of these expectations on the family,
on the grandchildren,
to kind of continue this work that, without really examining or having a conversation about like, why are we still doing this?
Right. And then the unhealthy codependency that then develops between the family and the town.
Yes.
Like they could very easily herd their donkeys on their own, but they insist that
Luisa.
Luisa's the one who come pick them up, and so like all of those things, it just becomes with every generation, the harm gets worse.
Yeah, and I think what's
Or the damage, I should say. I'm sorry.
yeah, and what's really sad is that, like, some people have interpreted the film as if like Mirabel never really had a power, right? And that's not true. It's like you could say the same thing about Abuela. Abuela never actually had a power, but wait. The whole miracle was born of Abuela's grief, and that was her power. Her strength was in her deep grief, which was her moment of feeling truly into her despair of her loss, right? And Mirabel's power is actually exactly the same. Mirabel's power is her power of feeling, right? And so she's always trying to give others and to hold up their strengths, and that's what makes her so powerful. And it's in the moment of doubt, when she's not sure that the doorknob doesn't light up and doesn't give her her own room, but it's really because the entire house is her domain, right? And just as like the entire house was Abuela's domain. And so she's really, what they're really doing there is they're setting her up as like sort of like the next matriarch of the family without really saying that. But there are all these conversations that are going on set, and it's not until that moment where Mirabel is able to experience that flashback where like the magic shows her exactly what her grandmother went through, that she's able to speak out loud what her grandmother has been unable to say, and where the grandmother finally has the breakthrough of like, yes, these are the things I've been going through, and like that I've been trying to repress, and like I didn't realize how much damage I was doing in the process, and that's intergenerational trauma.
Thanks for listening to this second segment from our conversation about communication. Please look out for the third and final segment soon. If you have comments or questions about anything we discussed, please send them to finloslives@gmail.com or via social media.